In this video I'm looking at how gender is presented in Of Mice and Men, and specifically how issues around gender influence how characters interact with each other. It is far from the only relevant social force that determines how characters behave in the novel, but of all the different forces in the novel, it's probably the one that has the greatest impact overall. Now, it's extremely important, before I do anything else, to be absolutely clear what we mean when we talk about gender. The key thing to understand is that gender is not the same thing as sex. Gender is not biological. It might be influenced by biology to a certain degree, but it's also influenced by society and culture. And consequently, concepts of gender vary between societies and cultures. A simple example would be the association of the colour pink with femininity, for reasons that are fairly arbitrary and for which there is no real objective, real-world link. It also influences not just how people behave, but how people are expected to behave, and how certain behaviours will be judged. And that, I think, is most relevant to a discussion of how gender is used in this novel. So let's start to look at some details, and we'll begin by looking at a concept of femininity and what it means to be feminine. There aren't many female characters in Of Mice and Men. Curly's wife is the only one who actually shows up, but we're told about some others, specifically Aunt Clara. Aunt Clara, Curly's wife, and very indirectly the prostitutes at the brothel the male characters visit, are the only female characters we encounter in this novel. What's interesting is that if you compare Aunt Clara and Curly's wife, you get very different ideas of what it means to be feminine. Aunt Clara is a matriarch. She is head of a family unit, or is head of as much of a family unit as the reader is ever told about. She is defined by her role within a domestic environment. She is there to look out for other characters, and she specifically charges George with the responsibility to look after Lennie. She passes that domestic role onto him. By contrast, Curly's wife presents a very different idea of what it means to be female. She is sexualized largely through how she is described to us and how characters within the novel treat her. There is a slight element where she is attempting to adopt a sexualized role for herself in how she chooses to interact with male characters, but it's also implied that that's exaggerated within the narrative. But equally, she is still defined by her role within a domestic family unit. She is Curly's wife. It should be noted, of course, that she doesn't ever get given a sense of her own identity within the text. She is only known as the wife of a male character. So in that regard, the sense that she is defined by her role as part of a family unit, maybe the difference between her and Aunt Clara is not as distinct as it first appears. Let's look at how she's first described. This is the very first direct description of her in the novel. A girl was standing there looking in. She had full rouged lips and wide-spaced eyes, heavily made up. Her fingernails were red. Her hair hung in little rolled clusters, like sausages. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that Steinbeck calls her a girl, which has connotations of innocence, of youth, of naivety. It's also very general. It doesn't give any real specific details. So what we are encouraged to notice as readers is that she is young, with all the baggage that that contains. What the description also offers us is a massively disproportionate focus on costuming, makeup, and choices of clothing. This is in direct contrast to the way male characters are described. With male characters, there's a much greater emphasis on innate physical qualities, like the shape of a face, which have nothing to do with choices made by that person. By contrast, Curly's wife is described in terms of the things that she has chosen to do to control and alter her appearance, like the makeup she's put on. And it's implied that her attempts to make herself look attractive are not entirely successful. The makeup is heavy. That simile that's used to describe her hair, like sausages, seems peculiar. It's not an attractive description. So there is a hint that she is not as attractive as she has attempted to make herself. And that, in its own way, illustrates that the deck is stacked against Curly's wife from the beginning. She is expected to look attractive and is expected to conform to some gender roles that the men are not. We should bear in mind, though, that we are only told what the narrative chooses to tell us, and if the narrative chooses to focus on hair and makeup and clothes, then that's what we're going to read about. So in that regard, we need to be a little bit careful when we're considering how much this description really fairly represents her. Now, her sexuality raises a whole new issue, which is the idea that gender involves an element of performance. Certainly sexuality involves an element of performance, which comes across through her makeup, through her body language. When we see, for example, her throwing her body forward, that is a performance of gender and a performance of sexuality. So one of the ways you can look at gender in this novel and in fiction in general is in terms of the way characters act certain roles. Now, that performance of Curly's wife is explicitly interpreted as threatening. The male characters feel that it's threatening, and they throw back a lot of very misogynistic insults at her, like tramp and bitch and jailbait. And while for simplicity I've picked 3 examples that are all on the same page, they're really scattered through the entire novel. There is only one indication where she really does make a genuine threat, and that's directed at Crooks. It's threatening him with lynching because he's a black man. And that has at least as much to do with race and social class as it does to do with gender. We see later on that Curly's wife is genuinely innocent and very lonely, and that just serves to underline how unfair it is that she's treated in such misogynistic terms. But that sense of threat comes from the fact that she is married. The male characters, it seems, don't feel particularly threatened by unmarried women like the prostitutes they go to visit. So one way you could think about this is that the threat doesn't come from Curly's wife, but from the fact that Curly is there behind her. Which brings us neatly on to talking about Curly. One of the biggest mistakes you could make if you're talking about gender is assuming that gender only refers to femininity and to women. You always need to be aware, and it's particularly overt in Of Mice and Men, that male characters act out gender roles just as much as female characters do, and Curly is a perfect example. Now look at that quotation that I've chosen to illustrate the character. Curly's like a lot of little guys. He hates big guys. Kind of like he's mad at them because he ain't a big guy. So Curly in the novel is aggressive. He picks fights with people. And it's implied that a lot of that aggression comes from a sense of insecurity because he's physically smaller than a lot of other men. And in that way we can see that he is acting out a role of extreme masculinity. His entire character is defined by the need to prove his masculinity to the other men. And therefore, he is as much trapped by gendered stereotypes and expectations as his wife. Now, gender is not the only element in play here. There's also an element of social class. Curly is very aware that his authority on the ranch comes from his family connections, rather than the kind of natural charisma possessed of a character like Slim. But the end result is ultimately the same. He is driven by the need to prove himself, prove his authority, prove his masculinity. And his reaction to the death of his wife needs to be looked at through that framework. He isn't upset because he loved his wife and now she's dead. He's upset because the fact that his wife is dead means that he has failed to protect her. He has failed to live up to the stereotype of what it means to be a husband, a stereotype that he's accepted. So his desire to get revenge doesn't come about through grief for her. It comes about because it's just one more way in which he needs to prove his masculinity, particularly when it was Lennie who injured him before. So let's look at Lennie. Lennie is a very unusual case, and it might appear at first glance that issues of gender don't seem to come up with Lennie, but that's really the point. Lennie, because of his cognitive impairment, does not exhibit any real gendered behaviour. He doesn't do anything that is stereotypically masculine. His enormous physical strength is not a manifestation of masculinity. Lennie isn't even aware of his strength. That's where the plot comes from, Lennie's inability to control his strength. So when he describes Curly's wife as being pretty, don't think about that as him showing sexual attraction. Lennie doesn't really have that element to him. He thinks Curly's wife is pretty in exactly the same way that he thinks the mouse is cuddly, and exactly the same way that he likes to stroke soft things like a velvet dress. And it's that lack of gendered behaviour in a context where you would expect gendered behaviour to exist that causes so much confusion among other characters. And the end result of this is the injury to Curly's hand and the death of his wife. And I'm combining both incidents together here because I think they have a common root. They come about because characters try to interact with Lennie using gendered stereotypes and a gendered frame of reference that is not appropriate. Curly challenges Lennie because it's a way of proving his own masculinity. Curly's wife uses a stereotypically feminine approach and uses Lennie as a source of comfort. And in any other case, if we were talking about any other character, both approaches would make sense. But they don't make any sense to Lennie. As a result of that misunderstanding, Curly is very badly injured. We never really know how badly, but it's pretty bad. And his wife is killed. In both cases, the incidents occur because Lennie panics. Lennie panics because he does not understand what the characters are doing to him, because he does not have that sense of gendered expectations. So the absence of gender and the absence of gendered behaviour, the absence of gendered expectations of behaviour, is also a relevant factor. So to sum up, I would argue that gender is the most significant driving force, at least between the interactions of Curly, Curly's wife and Lennie, maybe less so for some of the other characters. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are other social forces in play as well, like class. And those social forces relate to gender and interact with gender, but that's a matter for another video. For now, we'll just say that characters in this novel are expected to conform to gender roles. And when they don't, characters don't know how to react. They respond with discomfort, with confusion, sometimes aggression. And what we see is that because Curly and Curly's wife can't adapt to an unusual example, Lennie, they pay a heavy price for it.